Claudia, and thank you to the Education Committee. I want you to know, as President Levin and Stone Phillips come to the stage, that we have actually posted a call to action statement on our website. You can click and sign the petition and demonstrate your support as a member and as a leader of the World Peace Councils of America to the initiative that we're undertaking this year and to the importance of this issue of educating our next generation. So we very much encourage you to go to our website and sign our petition. And now, it is truly our privilege to have the President of Yale, Rick Levin, and Stone Phillips in a discussion on U.S. education competing globally. I could not think of a better way to start our conference, and this should be a very exciting panel. President Levin, as you know, is president of Yale University. He's also the Frederick William Meineke Professor of Economics. And before becoming president of Yale, he was dean of the Yale's Graduate School of Arts and Sciences. What's really significant about President Levin's reign as Yale president, and the compelling reason why we asked him to come tonight, is the commitment that he has made not only as an educator, but to educating the next generation of global citizens. He has invested, promised to invest more than $1 billion into the sciences at Yale. But even more significantly, he has committed himself and has dedicated himself to teaching Yale students in a way that goes beyond science and math and gets to the core of what global citizenship is all about. His speech to, I believe it was the Yale entering freshman class of 2006, was actually the inspiration for an education program that I worked on for World Affairs Forum. And he talked about not only the privileges and the benefits of a new global economy, and a new global interconnected world, but also the responsibilities of it to the students. But when he was describing what it was that we needed to do as the generation that was educating them, he talked about the importance, obviously, of math and science and engineering in terms of knowledge that students need to know in order to participate in leadership ways in this economy. But he also talked about the importance of language, of travel, of culture, and understanding all of these aspects in this new world that we were now entering. And we very much look forward to hearing what he has to say and to elaborate on this. And we have Stone Phillips to help moderate this discussion. Stone, as you know, is an outstanding award-winning journalist. He was anchor on NBC Dateline for over 15 years. He really put that program on the map. He put NBC on the map. Many of his interviews, and there's such a long list of them, were just outstanding and recognized as outstanding for NBC. But what I find also, I just want to add in terms of Stone's career in journalism and why he's a perfect person to moderate this discussion tonight and to launch our national discussion for this year-long series on the 6 top issues, was that Stone really took news and he took it out of the half-hour news presentations that we all watched, and he made it he penetrated the American public with news stories. And what Dateline did was actually take news and make it popular to hear and interesting to hear. And the best example I could give of the impact Stone had, in terms of taking news and bringing it to the American public, was I was sitting in church one Sunday. We were visiting my mother, and I was sitting in church with my daughters and drifting. And the sermon started, and I thought I really ought to pay attention. And our priest said, "Today I want to talk to you about Stone Phillips' report." And I thought, wow, that is when you make it to the pulpit. You've really penetrated. So thank you. I will turn this over to our 2 honored guests tonight.
Thank you, Lori. We're about Dateline. Lori and I were classmates at Yale. That's the reason I'm here. Okay? truth be told. And I was a religious studies and philosophy major, so it's not exactly an accident that I would wind up at the pulpit. It's a great pleasure to be here tonight for you, with you on this opening night of this conference. Lori is amazing. She was a dynamo in college. She remained so. Did she ever run out of energy? I don't know. Under her leadership and with your leadership and your support, this organization is really proving that all world affairs, like all politics, is local. They should be engaged and understood at a grassroots level. And I really salute the job you're all doing in all of your cities. I went on the website. I looked at some of the activities that were taking place in some of the cities across the country, and it was just very impressive. So anyway, I just want to tell you I'm delighted to be here. And it's an honor for me to be up here sharing the stage with you, President Levin. I was going to begin by apologizing for wearing a dangerously close to Columbia blue tie. Yours is about the same color. So I think I want to save ground there.
There's some yellow blue.
Okay, all right. I also had the sense that given the wild weather weekend we've just been through, from Maryland to Maine, that maybe we should be up here talking about global climate change. And I know scientists at Yale are working on that, aren't they?
Absolutely, major subject. Just before we start, I also want to thank Lori for inviting me and just commend all of you who work in your local communities to raise the consciousness of Americans about global affairs. It's such an important thing to do. And education does not begin and end at K through 12 with our universities. It's a lifelong experience, and the kind of work you do to bring awareness about global issues to the citizens of your cities is really, really important. So, congratulations on that great work.
President Levin, that the members of this organization voting on the top national security issues facing our country would put education first on the list. Says to me, there are a lot of smart people in this room. What does it say to you?
Yeah, no, I think it's very, it's very telling, and I think quite appropriate. I mean, there are, in a way, two levels at which the question needs to be addressed. I think one is education of our workforce, which is deteriorating because of the deteriorating conditions in our K-12 system. That is one thing we need to really be attentive to. And the other is maintaining the excellence, contrasting excellence and preeminence of our best research universities, because they are and remain the envy of the world, and they are what ultimately gives our economy the extra advantage in terms of having the best science done in this country and having the opportunity of taking that science to market ahead of our competitors. So it's really, it's an interesting dichotomy that we have a K-12 system in crisis and a higher educational system that at its pinnacle is really supreme in the world, and yet is even that being challenged by major investments by other countries. So it is a foreign policy issue.
The correlation between education and economic power has been a cornerstone of American thinking. Is this still on? Has it ever been more important?
It's certainly as important as ever. And it's important when you think about this historically. I would say there were really two periods. In the 19th century and early 20th century, it was the big competitive advantage of America as it emerged was a much higher literacy rate, much better basic education, reaching a much broader fraction of our population than was the case in Europe, which was the world as far as 19th century America was concerned. In the post-World War II period, though, there are these two levels that are both important. One is the persistent need to have a literate workforce, and indeed a math literate workforce as well, and computer literate. But also, since the Second World War, scientific innovation based on scientific knowledge has been a real driver of the world economy. And in the 19th century, America's advantage came from natural resources, abundant land, and kind of ingenuity with mechanical innovation. But today, innovation is really science-based. It's not the tinkerer in his shop at home. It really rests on huge investments in basic sciences that are done primarily in our universities. So we need to be attentive to both those levels today.
Let me read you a quote Among fully developed economies, global competitive advantage derives primarily from a nation's capacity to innovate, to introduce and develop new products, processes, and services. This has been the foundation of America's economic leadership in the period following the Second World War, and it will continue to be a basis for American economic strength in the highly globalized economy of the 21st century. You could have been Steve Jobs, but these are your words. You draw a direct line. You relate power to economic strength. You relate economic strength to leadership in science, engineering, innovation. I guess one question is, are we at the highest levels in our most selective universities? Are we leading in science and innovation?
Oh, very, very definitely still. And we're the model that the emerging nations of Asia are taking as the model to emulate. We still, produce the largest share of scientific papers. We win nearly half the Nobel Prizes. I mean, America still has extraordinary strength in science and all of the technical fields taught in our universities. But it's an increasingly competitive game.
So the academic wars being handed out in science and engineering at Yale are not all going to foreign-born.
Well, let's be careful about that. Half of the Nobel Prizes won by American scientists since World War II have been won by foreign-born Americans. And this is why it's so incredibly important for our future to have at least one aspect of immigration reform taken care of, and that is the staple of green card to the graduate diploma in science. By sending so many back home. And now I do make the argument in something else I wrote, and I think it's true, that we actually don't lose from educating people who go back home. Because my experience is that people who have the benefit of American higher education and have the benefit of living in an open society and understanding our habits and our ways of life and our way of thinking actually go back to their home countries in a way as ambassadors for American values.
You put forward a very provocative notion that the American Research University is a highly effective instrument for U.S. foreign policy.
Right.
And this is what you're talking about.
Exactly, that's one of the points. I mean, I really make about 4 or 5, maybe 6 arguments about why American universities are effective instruments of foreign policy. One is, as we said, they give us the scientific leadership on which our economic strength rests. Second, they give us a particular, our style of education, which is, in a way, a uniquely American product. The notion that undergraduate education at the higher levels, at our state universities as well as our top private institutions, consists of a non-specialized course of study. 2 years of general education followed by 2 years of a major quasi-specialization. We educate people more broadly. An American college graduate has an exposure to multiple disciplines, and that's different. That's different from a European graduate or an Asian graduate, where they specialize in one subject from age 18 on, and in fact, begin the professions, medicine, law, and so forth at age 18. This broader concept of American liberal education, I think, leads to more flexible individuals, a different way of thinking, looking at problems from multiple perspectives. I mean, how many of you in your daily lives, that little bit of college economics you had might help you, once in a while. Or that little bit of psychology you had might help you in figuring out the way people think. Or maybe the fact that you took a few courses in religious studies helps you to understand how religion influences the world.
But critics will say we're not cranking out enough engineers, enough scientists, that this well-rounded approach to education may not be serving us in terms of our competitive edge. You disagree with that?
I do. We look at China and India and say, oh my God, look at all the engineers they're training. And you know what? They look at us and they say, look at all the innovators and leaders, both in economic innovation in terms of new products, but also in organizational innovation and other ways of running organizations. I think that America is the place where all of that innovation occurs. So, and they are increasingly attributing that to the American system of liberal education, in part because of the multidisciplinary perspective I mentioned, in part also because of the kind of pedagogy we use, which is to educate people toward critical thinking, to ask people to think for themselves as opposed to regurgitate facts. Now, I grant you, this is a product, again, at the higher end of the spectrum of institutions, but we do have that in a way that's really quite unique. I would say Britain and the whole Anglophone world in a way has that aspect, if not the multidisciplinary aspect. They do have the point of the idea of teaching people to think for themselves, to examine arguments, to not simply to spit back in fact. Both those things conduce to creating people that are independent thinkers, creative, innovative, flexible, adaptive. China and India they're coming to Yale. The presidents of the universities in China and India come to Yale to learn about how to run universities. Incredible.
And you've been going to China.
Yeah, and we've been teaching them. Exactly. They're looking to try to figure out how can they adapt some of our practices.
You know, I must say when I saw the topic that we're going to be talking about, the first country that came to mind was China.
Yeah.
And wondering about what's going on over there. Tell us a little bit about the changes they're making, because these are the guys who are going to eat our lunch, and we're helping them, but at the same time, it's good for China that we're helping them reform, and it's good for Yale. Remind me how it's good for America. But talk to us a little bit about what's going on in China.
Well, I'll tell you what's going on, and then I'll tell you why I think it's a positive-sum game, not a zero-sum game. What is going on is China, as late as 1998, had only 5% of the sort of birth cohort at university age attending college. 5%. That's where the United States was, more than 100 years ago. They made a commitment. They realized they needed to expand their universities, and with unbelievable intensity, they quintupled the number of students going to college in that 10-year period. And so today they have about 23% of every birth cohort going to college. Now, at the bottom end of that, we're not talking about the world's best colleges, and they can't train teachers as fast as they can admit students, so they have lots of problems. But at the high end, the top 30 universities in China that have been singled out for special investment, they pour the resources in. They're building science labs like crazy. They're building new campuses. They're forming partnerships with global companies. You go to Shanghai Jiaotong University in Shanghai, the engineering school, it's surrounded by IBM, Microsoft, other Hewlett-Packard, other technology companies, right on the perimeter of the campus. It's astonishing how much they're investing. Now, the quality of their faculties is still far behind where we are, but they're beginning to make inroads. The dean at Shanghai Jiaotong was hired, a distinguishable professor at Ohio State University's engineering school, which is a very fine one. So that they're beginning to bring people back because, it's a land of opportunity. The economy is growing. They're starting to pay competitive salaries to get the best faculty. You can't build a world-class university overnight. It took Stanford and the University of Chicago, sort of latecomers, founded in 1892. Neither of those, maybe Chicago just before the Second World War would have been ranked among the very best schools in the country. Stanford certainly not until the 1960s. So it takes 50 to 70 years, at least in our country, to start from scratch and build a world-class university. The Chinese will do it in 25. They won't do it in 5, but they will do it in 25 or 30.
In many respects, from a humanitarian standpoint, other respects, it's great to hear that these strides, these advances, these reforms being undertaken in China. At the same time, what kind of challenges do these present to us from a competitive standpoint?
Well, the creation of knowledge has huge spillover benefits to everyone. So, to the extent they become good at research, they're going to do things that benefit all of us. It's a little bit like the misunderstanding about Chinese economic growth. American consumers should be sending a thank you note for the ability to buy cheap products from China. So there's
as long as those products are safe.
Exactly. But the point is, it's not. As long as they're creating value, and that value is in an open international trading system, there is benefit to everyone from China's development. Secondly, I think from just purely educational point of view, our students, we have lots of exchange programs. Our students go abroad. They spend a semester at Peking University. They spend a semester at Fudan University. If those universities get better, our students are going to get a better experience going abroad. And you may think that seems like very sort of a small potatoes kind of argument. And actually, I think this is really an important part of modern education. I think, to the extent possible, as many students as we possibly can get to spend time in another country is going to be good for America, good for the world. And so years ago, having enough international study and work internship opportunities overseas to make it possible for every single Yale student to get overseas. And we provide, for the students on financial aid, we provide extra financial aid to make that possible. And we've done it. We went from about 300 foreign experiences to 1,400 now. We have 1,300 in a class at Yale, so it's happening.
In these very difficult, challenging economic times, talk a little bit more, if you would, President Levin, about the importance of basic science and the role it plays, and whether there was any question that it translates into long-term economic growth.
Well, I think there's just no doubt, and that almost everything we do in terms of new products and new technologies ultimately rest on advances in the basic sciences. And the thing that's so important about supporting basic science is it's not something the private sector can do. I mean, I'm an economist. I really believe in the private sector. But the truth is, there's no incentive to invest in the really long-term innovations and really long-term science where you can't even foresee what the benefits will be. My favorite story is about a Yale professor named Bill Bennett, who was in the applied physics department at Yale in the 1960s. And he was studying some phenomenon funded by the Department of Defense called coherent light. Didn't even have the name of it. He invented what came to be known as the argon ion gas laser in 1962. In 1997, Professor Bennett had surgery for detached retina, and that surgery was done with an argon ion gas laser. But this is just one of, I could give you dozens of examples like that. The benefits of fundamental science, basic research, don't get realized for decades, and many of the benefits can't be foreseen at the time the science is done. That's why the federal government has to be the provider of funding for basic research. No company's going to find it.
Are you worried about that? I mean, are they going to maintain those budgets in this climate?
Unless we have a freeze up on this budget bargain and have automatic cuts, I think there's wise leadership on both sides of Congress that realize this is our seed cap, this is our seed corn, basically. I mean, I don't foresee radical cuts in the funding of the National Science Foundation, the National Institutes of Health. I think there's a pretty strong bipartisan consensus that there may be many things you want to cut. That's not a good thing to cut.
So the lights aren't going to go out. University research, basically.
I'll go cry wolf in front of all my professional friends, but I think that I have pretty good confidence. I'm served on President Obama's advisory committee on science and technology. We met today. We heard from Lamar Alexander, a Republican. He reminded us that he believes himself to be a Republican, and yet he said this is something, he will pull out all the stops that preserve support for science, because he give you the same arguments.
I think one of the reasons this was voted, education was voted the #1 issue here, also is because there was a general feeling of unease, a real concern among Americans that we are falling behind, that our students are not keeping pace with their foreign counterparts, that they don't do something about their and many of those problems, arguably most of those problems, are taking place in the K-12 arena, which is feeding into our colleges. we can talk about that. I know that Stephen Brill and Joel Klein later in the week are going to be talking about that as well. But higher education, colleges and universities are facing major challenges as well. And I'm curious what you would identify as the greatest challenge right now in higher education.
I think actually the big challenge to higher education nationally, I'm not talking about Yale now, we get the best and brightest and we see no slippage, we get. But I think the K-12 failure is the greatest challenge to higher education, not getting well-prepared students into the system. So I do think, that the topic that Joel Klein was addressing, by the way, I think Joel Klein is a national hero for the efforts he's made in New York City. We have to address performance in our schools, and we have to create incentives for schools that actually do perform. I think Joel Klein did some great work in New York. We have an interesting model we're testing now in New Haven that I'm very excited about, which is Mary Stefano was able to secure from the American Federation of Teachers what is still a unique singular teacher's contract. I think in part offered up because of pressure from Washington on the AFT that they should do something to demonstrate they actually care about performance in the schools. And so we have a system now that allows the lowest quintile of schools by the standardized tests every year to be reconstituted, which means essentially that the tenure contracts for teachers are abrogated. You can move people around, you can reassign them, you can bring in new principals and essentially rebuild the worst performing schools. The hope is that different schools fall into that bottom quintile over time, and you end up over a period of years reforming the whole system. There's assessments of teachers. There are going to be actual published evaluations of individual teachers in this system, and hopefully this will introduce some real competition for the performance standards of the system.
It's an amazing ray of hope. I can't help but feel a little cynical. I think that it can catch on, but maybe it will.
Yeah, there's some great models in this country. I mean, some of the charter schools are doing amazing things. If you look at the TIP schools, the Achievement First schools, both founded by young graduates, they really are setting the standard high, and they do it by setting high expectations for kids. They're not defeatists. They start out with inner city kids. The Achievement First schools in New Haven and New York basically admit by lottery, so the kids they're not cream skimming from the public schools, but the kids come in the door and the place is plastered with college pennants, and they say you can succeed. No excuses. You can succeed, and they do. I mean, you all should go visit one of these really great charter schools and see what is done. You go to the morning assembly, and they call out the kids that have done something good last week. Jamie, you wrote a great paper in your English class last week. Come forward, and the whole school will salute you. And it's all about reinforcing great behavior, setting expectations high, letting the kids feel that they can achieve, and also having an 8-hour or 7-hour school day, so that the kids don't have the whole afternoon free to get in trouble when in state school.
Over the next several months on the campaign trail, we are going to hear a lot about the role of the federal government and the Federal Department of Education in K-12 education. And there are many, certainly in the Republican field, who are speaking very plainly about the way with the Department of Education and really sending this back to the states. Do you want to weigh in on that? Do you have a thought on that?
Well, let's ask ourselves the question, who's been running the school system for the last 50 years while it's deteriorating? The states. So not clear to the federal government to do any better, but the point is that sending it back to states is no panacea. We need a strategy. We need to encourage. We need to find ways to motivate, good performing schools.
Are you hopeful that we can make these changes?
In my business, I've got to be hopeful. I do see some great experimentation. we can only get more people to adopt some of these strategies. There are ways of both. I think they'll apply to the same thing.
A couple of weeks ago, you convened a panel of top economists at Yale. This was on the eve of the Occupy New Haven movement, I believe.
Yes.
If I'm not mistaken. I'm curious about that. You said that from an educational standpoint, and because it's Yale, I suppose, that you felt compelled to join the discussion. Tell us a little bit about that.
You know, I did grow up in the 60s, and teach-ins were part of the vocabulary, so when we...
You might want to explain to the students in their audience what a teach-in is.
A teach-in is sort of bring your faculty, bring in some outsiders that talk about whatever the issues are, you know, in a forum where there can be intelligent discussion. It's an alternative to street protest, meant to educate on the same subject. So when we were having, you know, Vietnam protests in my youth, you know, intelligent school administrators, the college administrators were organizing teachers. So I thought, well, they're going to come to New Haven. Let's have a teach-in on the economy, and let's take seriously the concerns that income distribution in this country has been worsening for the last 25 years, and what are the remedies? How can that be addressed? And let's take seriously the fact that we haven't restarted the economy sufficiently since the crash of 2008. What are some of the remedies? I brought together some of the best people in my department, which is my department, the Yale Economics Department, and we had a really lively and interesting discussion and took questions from the audience, went on for a couple hours, and I think, you know, we actually drew about 4 times as many people as showed up on the Levin Green for the Occupy New Haven.
Did the professors do any better than the politicians at reaching some kind of consensus?
I'll be modest. I think that if the United States economy had been in the hands of the Yale Economics Department over the last 3 years, we would have done a lot better.
We're waiting. What's the answer? What were some of the ideas that were resolved?
Well, some of it was backward looking about the stimulus that we had, which is getting a bad rap, to be ineffective. It really was ineffective because it was too small and focused on the wrong objective. So cutting the payroll tax when you've got over-leveraged consumers doesn't lead to job creation. It leads to people paying down their credit card debt. Direct spending on jobs is actually the only way to get a multiplier that's going to address the unemployment problem. So that's one. That just shows the economics department. We're all old-fashioned Keynesians in one respect. But you know, the other is how to deal with the mortgage crisis. And my colleague Jonathan Coppolis has been talking about this for 3 years. That, you know, when you have a situation with so many homeowners underwater in their mortgages, the right thing to do is actually write down the principal of the mortgage loan rather than just cut the interest payments, because it changes all the incentives, and now you have skin in the game again, and we'll do what we can to preserve your state. And
he thinks that's achievable.
Well, no, he just thinks let's remember
the right thing.
Yeah, we were talking about the right thing to do. At one point in the discussion, one of my colleagues, Judy Chevalier, very fine economist, said, you know, almost nothing we propose is politically feasible. And you know, as I was moderating, I said I had to agree, but you know, somebody should be saying the right things because eventually people come around to the right ideas. That's one of the great beauties of democracy. Maybe it takes an awful long time, but you know, the right ideas want to be advanced, and sort of pre-compromising. I think the first Obama stimulus package was a pre-packaged compromise. They thought they could get a bipartisan bill, and so they thought they had to do tax cuts. Larry Summers knew that wasn't going to work. I mean, good economists, I think, realized we should have been creating jobs directly, but you know, you wanted to get full consensus around this, so you don't actually favor it right, to try to do what's feasible. I'm not saying that's a mistake politically; it's probably the right thing to do. But you know, they didn't get any Republican votes for all the free compromises, so I would have been happy to stand there.
I'm curious your response to the news this week. You know, as an economist, MF Global, John Corsign's group, that has just gone into bankruptcy. $44.4 billion in liabilities, $1.4 billion in equity. Do we need to consider limits on leverage? Have we learned anything?
So you bet. So that's another, the same group that this teacher also stressed that point, and frankly stressed the same point 3 years ago in the same group had another teacher, which is we forgot about how to do monetary policy correctly. We set the interest rate. Now we kept it too low for too long, and that was part of it. That was what ultimately created the credit bubble. But we also forgot that you should have countercyclical regulation of leverage. That in a slump, you should actually be letting banks lever up more. And in a boom, you should be tightening up on capital requirements, be countercyclical. You don't just contract credit by raising the interest rate, you also raise the capital requirements on banks. Now, the Basel III rules, which are being promulgated, they do recognize this, and they're proposing a zone of discretion that will be explicitly countercyclical in the capital requirements of banks. And these Basel III requirements are setting, I think, the banks are screaming, but they're setting the capital requirements at much more sensible levels than we had gotten used to. The problem is there's a huge, effectively credit creation system outside banking, and that's effectively, you know, there's a lot of gamblers out there, like Corsign's enterprise, that are very hugely leveraged. Now, if you could separate those from the commercial banks that are serving the public, then they wouldn't be so systemically important, and you could let those guys go belly up. What happened was they all got entangled. And the big banks were both playing speculative games and over-leveraging, and also trying to serve the basic function of making loans to normal businesses and normal homeowners. And that was really the problem. I personally would agree with some version of the Volcker rule that limits the proprietary trading of banks and basically banking.
Speaking of leverage and turning us back to education, a lot of students are going deeply into debt because of the rising cost of college tuition. What are we going to do?
Well, you know, this is a problem, although it's historically not been. You know, right now it looks like it's a problem with the economy so bad, but historically we've managed student loan burdens pretty well. Most students that get loans do manage to pay them off, and it doesn't deliver a crashing blow. I mean, the reality is, long term, in more normal times, the returns to 4 years of college education are sufficient to justify debt burden. The average earnings of a college graduate are 67% higher than the average earnings of a high school graduate. So that's enough to repay your debts over time. And you know, I think what we're seeing right now is really a sort of secular consequence of
Correct me if I'm wrong. The increases in college tuition are far outpacing inflation. I mean, it's
yes.
Why are they going up so fast?
Well, there's two components. There's a structural component that is probably inflation plus 1%. That's a consequence of the fact that in the education sector, we don't, you could even say we can't, increase productivity as fast as the average of the economy. So sectors that have very fast technical change, very fast productivity growth, their relative prices are going to fall over time. Airline fares are not much different today in nominal dollars than they were 30 years ago. And that's because we've had huge gains in productivity as successive generations of aircraft. Computing and things like that, even more dramatic gains. So those prices fall. Where you can't reduce the amount of labor input per unit output, those relative prices are going to rise. Do you want us to have class sizes of 40,000 or 14? You know, I mean, the point is you can't, colleges are still teaching 15-person seminars and 100-person lecture courses. And unless you, and the input is the professor and the output is the students. And unless you are willing to accept much larger class sizes, you're not going to get an improvement in productivity of the sort that you get in other industries. That's why the relative prices go up. And that's structural. The actual inflation in college costs over the last decade and a half, though, have been driven much more by the failure of state governments to support state institutions. So while private institutions have been at about inflation plus 1, state institutions have been at inflation plus 3 or inflation plus 4 because of, and even worse, the recession.
California.
Yeah, even worse.
The dean at the Berkeley Law School, you may be aware of this, but the regents in California imposed a last minute across the board tuition hike at the state schools out there of $1,068. And so the dean of Berkeley Law School dipped into his funds and awarded each student at Berkeley Law School a scholarship of $1,068 to offset. I'm sure that made the families happy. It's not a long-term fix, but it speaks to this issue.
Yeah.
It speaks to the,
the
burden.
The wealthy endowed schools like Yale, Harvard, and Princeton have essentially done the same thing. It costs less if you're making under $65,000 today. That's the median income in the United States. You make less than $65,000, your child goes to Yale or Harvard for free. There's no charge. So strongly, strong redistribution.
This is the question I've been waiting to ask all night, okay? Last week, an education forum in New York, Newt Gingrich was speaking, and he allowed us to have his opinion. Schools like Harvard and Yale should be not charging tuition.
We're not.
It should
for people
he didn't think it should be charged for anything.
English appeals to.
He said you were ripping off the country.
Unless you make over $200,000, you don't pay full tuition.
I'm not sure he understands the need-based system at Yale, but maybe he was advocating free tuition for rich students. I don't know what he's saying.
Well, it's sort of like the current tax code, right?
I have another quote for you when we want to start to wrap up. We can't bail or tax cut our way to prosperity. We can only, as Steve Jobs understood, invent our way there. And to do that, we need to reinvigorate our traditional formula for success. Quality education, open immigration, the right rules to incentivize risk-taking, and government-financed scientific research. And that means we need to cut spending, raise tax revenues, upfront spending, and credible long-term fiscal reform.
Sounds like a good plan to me.
Tom Friedman, whose opinions I respect. That sounds like a pretty good formulation to me.
Very good. Tom and I talk all the time about this stuff.
A few more questions, and then we are going to open it up to the audience if you have a question, so you can be gathering your thoughts here. I wanted to ask you, President Levin, if you had one idea, one thought, to whisper into the ears of our presidential candidates over this next year, what would it be?
Oh my. I would say stop oversimplifying and really talk about the issues. I think one of the biggest problems with political discourse today has been reduced to slogans, to sound bites, to sort of oversimplifying what are complicated issues, treating the American public like they're idiots, and not respecting that in truth, I think the public would respond to an intelligent conversation about these difficult issues. And so talking about it more seriously and not just repeating the same old. I mean, how many Republican debates can we watch where the same people say the same thing night after night? Everybody's got a message. Let's have a real discussion. That's what I'd say. Break out of this one.
And what would you say to a prospective student weighing costs and opportunities of a college education and the prospects of his or her finding a job for her field of interest?
I'd say this recession will be over someday, and college education is the best investment you can make. And don't worry about what field you choose for your major, because you're going to learn the life skills and the ability to think intelligently to adapt to a future. And if you're one of the kids that's going to, the top 200 colleges and universities in the country, you're going to go on to get another degree after this anyway, and specialize and professionalize. So make the most of your college education and learn as much as you can, and recognize that it's a great investment in your future.
On that note, I'd like to open up the floor. I think we have a couple of roving microphones, and we have a question or two. And if you don't have a microphone, if you'll speak up, and perhaps I can repeat it, and we can go that way. Yes.
Diana Necromonte from Brookings Institution, and I'd like to relate the issue of education to Mexico. Mexico, likewise, has made education reform a priority. But President Levin, my friends in Mexico present me with a dilemma that I find hard to answer, but you have maybe the answer. And it goes to the issue of training our young men and women in problem solving. They understand STEM, science, technology, engineering, mathematics, but problem solving presents a threat. Problem solving presents the young men and women who leave school because teaching is so dull and rote and join the gang. So problem solving is a threat not only to the family, it's a threat to the community. What answer should I give as I return to Mexico next week to say that problem solving is an inherent fact?
Can you repeat the question?
That was the best line of the night. The question strikes at the heart of the issue of the importance of critical thinking, problem solving, divergent thinking, if you will, in education, not just memory or memorizing a body of knowledge. And the question has to do with convincing young people in Mexico who are being seduced by other influences that that's important. They should stay in school to learn that kind of skill.
Well, Mexico's got big difficulties, and I know you more than anyone I know is well aware of these. But how do you, I think that the answer is the pedagogy in schools and universities in Mexico has to make a transition from the boring and the rote memorization and the strictly didactic to the more interactive and engage the students more. It's a question of strengthening the quality of teaching. Now, how do you do that? It's a hard task to do, but I mean there are opportunities for, let's say, educating teachers and doing workshops. Advising the government to spend some time, maybe bring people who have the benefit of higher education outside Mexico, who are on the faculties to help spread the practices that work best. I mean, it's not an easy thing to solve, but obviously important.
Right here.
Yes.
I'm a former vice chairman of the Florida State Board of Regents, and I have seen many graduating classes that stood up like schools with en masse in my field of law, journalism, with all due respect, after Watergate, and so forth, and small classes in science and technology. So my question is, what is the responsibility and what techniques can governance boards of universities and university systems use to develop those schools that we have a social and economic and financial national need, even though the demand may be for other schools or special studies and so forth, because the pressure is not on those schools. The pressure is not to fund science and technology. How does a governance board push those schools instead of the ones that there may be a popular interest in at that particular time? Thank you.
So this is, I think everybody heard that. This is a great question and an important one. Something like 30% of students entering college want to major in math, science, or engineering. And less than half that number end up majoring in math, science, and engineering. Significantly less than half. This is a problem we in the business called MELT of science and math students. There's an increasing body of evidence that suggests that there really are ways to combat this by more engaged teaching. Perhaps more than is the case in the humanities and social sciences, the mode of teaching in the sciences, elementary science, the first level courses, is the large lecture format, which is boring and which students don't retain. And work has been done to prove that if you only do things as simple as ask students to click on a clicker every 5 minutes with their answer to a problem you put on the board, that their retention at the end of the lecture doubles. It gets even better if you break up the lecture every 15 minutes, ask a question, a kind of hard question to the class, and say, take 3 minutes and talk to your neighbor and figure out the answer to this problem. In other words, any way that engages the student more and it gets them out of passivity, actually has a great learning advantage. And so we're on the President's Council on Science and Technology. We are working on a report that actually will attempt to sort of promulgate some of this evidence and explain that there's two things that really can keep people in science and engineering. And that is, one, this kind of changing the format of the classroom. I mean, because after all, in the humanities and social sciences, asking the class questions and having give and take is much more common than it is in the sciences. So do it more in the sciences, engage the students. And the second is give them research experiences early on. Don't have these boring teaching labs where everybody does the same little experiment and the same test tubes to get answers that you could get right out of a textbook. But actually get people engaged in a real research project. Go do the kind of things that excite the imagination of grade school kids. Go out and collect stuff in the park. And come back and analyze it. That's a better way. And there are better ways to learn science than we're practicing in most of our schools, including in Yale. And I think that is the kind of solution we need.
Another question?
There's one over here. Okay.
Yes.
Okay, so we've heard about the failure of state, structural challenges. These are problems that you're suggesting. What about administrative bloat? Many colleges, universities have an explosion of deans, vice deans, administrators versus academics. I'm sure your university doesn't have this issue, but many across the country, they do have this issue. So can you talk a little bit about this problem that many academic institutions have?
I'm proud to say that despite many forces working in the opposite direction, we've kept the ratio of staff to faculty from rising over the past 20 years. So, but that's not true in a lot of places. You're right, there's a larger fraction of money is spent on staff, increasing relative to faculty. Part of this, I'm going to now sound like a Republican. Part of this is the increasing compliance and regulatory burden that are imposed by many, many federal regulations. We have had to increase staff way disproportionately. in these areas of regulatory compliance. So part of it is really imposed by government. I think, I think except for the stuff you have to do, you really ought to be trying to make the administration as lean as you can. And it's something that, I mean, our adjustments, for example, and I think most of our sister institutions that I'm familiar with, the main adjustments to the recession came through rationalizing staff, reducing expenditures on essentially the non-essential personnel in the university.
But, it's good to hear that Yale is doing that, but many institutions across the country are not doing that.
No.
Yes.
This may sound like a very simplistic question, and it probably is. I'm going back to your comment about our problems begin in K through 12 for, say, 150 years or more. We have managed to educate, at least to, say, the 8th grade or high school level, the children of immigrants, people who did not speak English, people from farms. And we may not have educated them all, but we produced enough students that were floating up and doing good things for themselves and for the country. And somehow or another, either there are more people floating up, which would be a good thing, or we're just not doing the job as well. I'm not an educator, I would just love to hear your opinion about what's changed and how we can do it better.
It's a puzzle, I think. We still do. There's no question that America is a great place for immigrants to come get an education and advance themselves and bootstrap up through the educational system. And that's still true for some categories of immigrants. I mean, you've got Vietnamese and various immigrant groups that have done an extraordinary job in moving up in a single generation, from poor immigrant status to economic success. So we're still capable of delivering that. I think. Our biggest problems are in the inner cities. There's just no question about it. That's where it's the urban schools with largely poor populations, with living in unstable neighborhoods where there's high male unemployment. Where you're in this sort of cycle of poverty and not having the kind of support structure at home that needs to complement the schooling. So you can't blame it all on the schooling. It's a really.
I was going to say one of the very strong messages from Davis Guggenheim's documentary "Waiting for Superman" last year was that schools fail because communities fail. That was a central point. I think that's what you're saying. And then the two of course feed on each other. But as communities struggle, communities deteriorate, that has a very parental stress, less involved in the lives of their children and students. I mean, there's so many factors here.
That's why one of the successful strategies in these inner city schools is engaging the family or single parent, as is usually the case, in the child's education. I think that's an important component.
Thank you very much.
Are you okay with a few more? Sure. Yes.
Yes, I'm the head of a boarding school in New England, and the writings of Alfred North Whitehead said that the purpose of the university is to join together the young and the old in the imaginative consideration of learning.
I love that.
And I love it, and I believe that's true not just at the university, but lower. What do you think schools like Yale and others can do to help to support and help us move away from this nationalized testing road that we're on to the imaginative consideration of learning by adults and children?
forward. I think we have to recognize that the kind of imaginative learning that Whitehead was envisioning, the kind of children you're probably educating, and certainly the kind of young adults that we're educating, experience they're quite capable of that engagement. I think we have a deeper problem in society is that we're not getting enough kids to a level where they can actually have that experience. And so, I can't say I'm against standardized testing because you have to have some yardsticks to measure the performance of schools, and without testing, it's quite hard to do. So it's a conundrum. In an ideal world, of course you wouldn't have it. You'd have learning communities from preschool onward, and great teachers that were capable of imaginatively engaging students. Unfortunately, we don't have a teacher corps of that quality. We have them in fine boarding schools. We have them in many liberal arts colleges and universities in our country, but it's not reaching down to get the all of the strata of American society. And so we have to resort to cruder instruments.
I want to come back to your teaching topic from before. You mentioned the importance of math and science, and yet for many years until recently, a lot of our best and brightest have been going to Wall Street. And I've seen
a lot of them are physicists and economists, right?
And I've seen the upside and downside of that during my tenure at MF Global. So I would ask you, is there anything that should be done at the education level, or if you do get a chance to listen to politicians' ears again, to create incentives for people to pursue other areas, or disincentives for people to pursue Wall Street careers?
Well, I think I really have no animus against Wall Street. I think largely that it was a lax regulatory environment that allowed bad things to happen on Wall Street. So I think it's we citizens are ultimately responsible for the failure of Wall Street. I wouldn't go blaming Wall Street. That's probably not very popular, I also think that we need to make we obviously need to give students a good sense of the joys and pleasures of many different kinds of occupations and vocations. Exciting people's curiosity about science and thinking of science or engineering as a career is something that we could do better, and we need to do better because it's important for the strength of the economy. I would rather approach the problem that way, rather than creating disincentives to go into finance. Let's create stronger and more powerful attractors to get people into science and engineering.
Yes, please.
President Levin, I'd like your perspective on our national will to support basic sciences and put it in the context of the Large Hadron Collider is not in Texas. It's in France and Switzerland.
Yeah, well, we were going to do it in Texas, right? That was the original plan, and it didn't happen. I think we have to be. We needn't think we need to monopolize big science, but other countries are. Europe is an economy as large as the United States, a little larger actually, and so we shouldn't think that we have to monopolize large-scale investments in science, but we do need to make those as well as the small-scale stuff. I mean, we've been very good about historically about making the small-scale investments. I mean, the biological sciences, the life sciences have largely been small-scale. Most of the money goes to individual investigators or small teams that in bite-sized chunks, and we get incredible mileage out of it in terms of great discovery. Physics and today. Certainly in particle physics and the people addressing the really exciting questions of the origins of life and the origins of the universe. This takes big scale, say space telescopes, it takes colliders. Those are big investments, and we should be making our share of what we have been flagging in the last decade, 15 years or so. it would be good when the economy, I wouldn't say it's the first thing on the agenda, but when the economy comes back, to start making those investments.
Just a couple more, because it's the hours we could. Yes, please.
President Levin and Mr. Phillips, thank you very much for being here. My name is Victoria, and I'm from the Cleveland Council on World Affairs. I was fortunate enough to receive a scholarship to attend this function, and I would like you to expand a little bit more on the relevance of an undergraduate degree. Just speaking from my experience, and I'm sure some of the other young professionals in this room might agree that the cost of higher education is increasing and the value is decreasing. I feel that as excited as I was as a freshman, the reality is that it qualifies you to file papers and enter data. And just what advice would you give, and why is the undergraduate degree relevant, and why is, I mean, the cost is increasing, I think, because a lot of universities think that a rock climbing wall and virtual golf are essential to, you know, graduating. And I mean, I went to class with my friend from Germany during a time, this was in 2009, where they were protesting 500 euros a semester fees, and it's like, we would gladly pay that out of pocket. It's better than $35,000 a year for, you know, virtual golf. So I would like you to explain a little bit more on the relevance of an undergraduate degree for our generation.
Well, the solution is not to make education an entitlement, as has been the case. I think that's going to be, you know, I think it's already proving unsustainable, and you're seeing the introduction of fees throughout your controversial as it is. I think it's inevitable. Education is expensive. You're getting attention of faculty, and you're getting opportunities, you know, in a good institution. You have opportunities to be in classes where there's at least some of them are small enough to get to know the faculty and get to engage with them in a serious way. That's just an inevitable truth. I mean, as I was citing before, the historical evidence, in particular, since the technological changes that led to the computer revolution, and in particular the coming of the personal computer and distributed computing, we've seen nothing but a steady rise up to the onset of the Great Recession in the premium in terms of earnings that college offers. In 1973, the premium through college education was 40% more than what a high school. Lifetime earnings were 40% higher if you were a college graduate than if you were a high school graduate. Today it's 67%. It's really a steady rise from about 1980 forward. And that's a long-term trend that's not, I don't think that there may be a small dip in that because of the recession. But I think that trend, the forces underlying that trend, will continue. The labor force, the demands for a better educated labor force are only going to increase, particularly in a country like ours, where we can't compete in the low skill jobs, because the cost of labor is so much lower in Asia and other places. So we need a skilled, high-wage labor force that's going to make us competitive in industries where high schools are required. You'll get there.
Yeah.
Hard while you're on the way. You'll get there.
I would just add to that I think it goes back to your comments about critical thinking, because I made the somewhat masochistic decision to be a philosophy major at Yale, and very dense reading, very challenging material. I have never regretted it because of its almost scientific approach. I mean, it taught me so much about critical thinking. That is a skill. It's not necessarily a talent, it's a skill. And that's where I learned it. And it has served me so well over the course of my career as I look at stories, as I try to develop stories, as I try to think critically or skeptically about a story. It has just, I can't even imagine not having developed that skill. And I think it would be just as valuable to me had I been a graduate in 2011 as 1977. So I think that's a tremendous value of college education, and it's important take full advantage.
And it would have worked for you even if you become a bond trader.
I'd like to think so. I'm not sure, though. I'm not sure. One more question.
This is live. Norma Meidel, World Affairs Council, Central Coast, California. What is Yale, what are Yale and other universities and colleges of its ilk doing to encourage and educate teachers, K-12 teachers, to address the problems that you have described?
Well, that's a great question. We don't have a school of education, but I'm very proud to say that the #1 employer of Yale graduates for the past 5 years has been Teach for America. Yale College graduates have been Teach for America. And the general critical thinking skills and passion for learning that we try to inculcate in our students and have been at least successful with at least one, I think is motivating a lot of young people today to think that teaching is a profession that really needs attention and warrants their commitment. And while it is true, we all know the strengths and weaknesses of Teach for America. I mean, it is a large melt out of that program. People go do it for a couple of years and then don't pursue teaching career. But you know, a substantial number of them do. And they're going to make a difference. The schools I mentioned earlier, the KIPP schools and the Achievement First schools are overwhelmingly staffed by graduates from Teach for America. So it's out of our elite colleges, an awful lot of kids are taking that route, and that's very encouraging.
President Levin, I think we have one more question. I think it's from a student. You?
Correct. Yeah.
Yeah, let's take this one. Sure. So, Mr. Mayor Light.
They're always the hardest question.
Thanks for taking my question. Actually, my question is kind of threefold, but I promise they're all related because I'm a liberal arts student. So the first is, we kind of talked briefly about how the state level has failed students. And I'm wondering kind of on the policy level, how the state level has failed the students, how also on the national level maybe is better poised to serve the student, and why the Republican candidates are wrong in saying that the Department of Education should be, disbanded. And I am a supporter of the Department of Education. I'm just wondering.
I think that it's a well ingrained tradition in America. It probably would not make sense to reverse that there's a great deal of local control of our schools. I'm not saying that can be undone. I think one of the advantages of having, some both pressure for national standards is, some kind of national system of testing and assessment, I think is a good thing. I also think that having the kind of resources available that only the federal government can muster to create programs that create incentives for rewarding really strong school districts that are doing reform. I mean, some of the programs that Secretary Duncan has initiated seem to be right on the mark. The Race to the Top programs and the Incentive Innovation Awards, or whatever they're called. These are efforts to actually send federal funding in the direction of states and local districts that have good plans for improvement, and that we're not necessarily getting adequate support directly from state funds. So, I think the Department of Education has a role. It's not going to be the preponderant. It is not. It's nowhere near the preponderant funder of education. The preponderant funder of education in this country is local property taxpayers, and that's going to remain the case, I'm sure, for a long time. So, but I do think there's a role for a standard bearer and for a federal effort to sort of encourage innovation and the dissemination of innovation through the system.
Thank you for your question. I would just end by saying that, setting all humility aside, Yale has always prided itself on graduating 1,000 leaders every year. I guess it's more like 1,300 now. But sometimes all it takes is one. I would just say that we need her more now than ever. Keep up the good work. Thank you.